speak for everyone, reluctant to bring those in. But now we have our third panel, Belonging and Resistance, and I am happy to introduce our first panelist, and this is Jamel Watkins. Jamel Watkins is a postdoctoral fellow in German studies at Stanford University. She received her PhD in German studies from UMass Amherst in 2017. She's interested in race and gender in contemporary German society. Her current book project, Roses for Angela, deals with the East German fandom of Angela Davis. Today, she shares part of an article she is currently writing on Black hair in Germany. Thank you. Welcome, Jamel.
Thank you. In this paper, I consider the ways in which hair becomes a significant marker for race for Afro-Germans, regardless of gender, especially in a majority white nation that often rejects Blackness. And also, just so that you know, in this paper, I will refer to Afro-German and Black German synonymously. I demonstrate the complexity of hair for Black Germans, oftentimes signifying a negative trait that they need to change, and other times representing a space for self-love, empowerment, community, and acceptance. Using personal narratives, autobiography, and film, I illustrate the impact of growing up with Black hair in Germany and how that brings these people to a process of self-love. I provide a close analysis of those different mediums in order to show that these seemingly banal and small moments are actually quite impactful and have a larger significance in German society. Here has a larger relevance, examining literary and film examples of the toxic discourses regarding Black hair in Germany. These works serve as an intervention to counter those toxic environments and transform negative connotations of Black hair. Many Black feminists and womanist theorists have researched beauty standards in Blackness, or that is to say, the multiple ways that whiteness does not allow for Black beauty to be possible. Bell Hooks describes the way the beauty standard has always been a white beauty standard by saying, quote, "Exposing the myriad of ways white supremacy has assaulted our self-concept and our self-esteem, militant leaders of Black liberation struggle demanded that Black folks see ourselves differently. See self-love has radical political agenda," end quote. Validating different types of beauty and unsubscribing from white beauty standards serve as self-love. Rejecting those Anglo-European standards requires a deprogramming of sorts and going against everything Black people have been taught. Instead, it entails redefining beauty on their own terms. Hair care and styles are just one important way Black women can see themselves differently. Beyond adornment, it enables curating a self-image that is positive and empowering. In the article, Decolonizing My Hair, Unshackling My Curls in Autoethnography, Carolette Norwood reflects on her own hair journey and also engages with Patricia Hill Collins on knowledges, consciousnesses, and empowerment. One particular powerful passage on rebellion in Black hair is relevant for my discussion of Krauselocken. Norwood reveals, quote, "Embracing the natural Black aesthetic is often read as rebellion, and in some ways it has to be. It is the reality of Black-skinned people who can decide that they are just fine the way God made them and choose not to adhere to Western white standards. Not to stand invisible or neutral within the white norm essentially means standing deviant and in rebellion," end quote. Norwood's reading of her own hair journey as inherently political is also relevant for Germany, where the traditional standards of blonde hair and blue eyes are even more extreme. Black Germans do not fit into the norm of beauty and citizenship and are excluded from both. In a piece from Kleine Drei, which actually means less than three, but is written as a little sideways heart, the blogger Alice comments on how Black women do not fit the Western beauty standards like Norwood and considers her hair as a political statement. She explains, "Meine Haare sind kraus und schwarz. Sie sind das buchstäbliche Gegenteil vom restlichen Schönheitsideal blond und glatt. Und deswegen stehen meine Haare genau am anderen Ende der Schönheitshierarchie unten," end quote. That is particularly Black hair has the least beautiful or ugly it is remarkable that when Black Germans do choose to wear their natural hair. Berlin-based Afro-Portuguese critical theorist and artist Greta Colomba considers the social and cultural relevance of hair within the Black and African diaspora in her book Plantation Memories. Colomba recognizes the significance of Black hair because historically it was associated with enslavement. Colomba clarifies, more than skin color, hair became the most potent mark of servitude during the enslavement period. Black hair became a symbol of primitivity, disorder, inferiority, and uncivilization. African hair was then classified as bad hair. At the same time, Black people were pressured to relax bad hair with appropriate chemicals developed by European industries. As Colomba proves, bad hair is so often synonymous with Black hair. There's a history of Black people manipulating their hair to appease those who have oppressed them in the past and present, which is another type of oppression because Black people can never simply just be. Within the context of Germany, it is important to remember in the discussion of race and hair, there were real-life ramifications for not having blonde, straight hair for Afro-Germans like Hans Hauch and others who lived during the Third Reich. In her book, Other Germans, Tina Camp describes, quote, the Nazi sterilization of Black children of the Rhineland occupation represents one of the most extreme consequences of the discourses of race and racial purity that converged in the Rhineland campaign, as well as the most concrete response to the threat posed by this imaginary specter, end quote. Hauch explains that the Aryan paragraph quite clearly defined who was German or of a related race, and of course this Aryan paragraph excluded him and the other Black Germans. This anxiety around pure race was has a heightened meaning in the German space, a striking difference from other Black diasporic groups. While there are many similarities among Black diasporic communities, it is important not to forget the very real racial anxiety manifested through hair in Germany during the Nazi period and beyond. For instance, Hauch explains that he straightened his hair with sugar because he wanted blue eyes and blonde hair. Next, he discussed that his failed attempt to straighten his, what he calls kinky hair, with the sugar. His source of pride in his identity exists in between these moments, but for him, this happened after many, many years. So hair is so often a gendered marker associated with women, but it also impacts Afro-German men. In his autobiography, Destined to Witness, former editor of Ebony, Hans Massaquoi, describes his relationship with his hair. He first mentions hair in his autobiography as he entered school the first time. In order to be less conspicuous, his mother had cut his hair off. He explains, quote, but my fear of teachers, which I shared with most school beginners, was only one of my problems. My biggest worry, which I tried to keep to myself, was having to face hundreds of strange children and the certainty of racial taunts and ridicule. In an obvious attempt to make me less conspicuous, my mother told my barber, albeit with a heavy heart, to get rid of my generous afro, which I wore decades before it became the rage in the United States, and that my mother loved as much as I detested it, end quote. With his quotation, he indicates how much hair was a huge priority. His attempts to fit in, though, were in vain. A classmate taunted him by touching his hair and calling him the N-word. Massaquoi describes his rage with the boy who put his hand on my head and mockingly stroked my hair. Why do Negroes grow sheep wool instead of hair on their heads, he asked me. To which Massaquoi responds by kicking him. Hair was significant for him as a child, and his attempt at fitting in, that's cutting his hair, was unsuccessful. Massaquoi was teased for his skin color and hair, both marking him as an outsider in Germany. Trying to pass in the German context was another option. In the narrative, in the groundbreaking work Farbe bekennen, Helga Emde discusses the pains she took in order to try to fit in or pass in German society. Emde did not want to deal with the constant accusations that she did not belong or hear comments about her physical appearance. And she reveals, quote, when I was about 13, I started to straighten my, she called it horse hair, so that it would look more like white people's hair that I admired so much. I was convinced that with straight hair, I would look conspicuous. I would squeeze my lips together so that they appeared less puffy. everything to make myself beautiful and less conspicuous. So I'm going to draw your attention here to her word choice. First, she labels her own hair as horsehair. This trope of black hair has horsehair has global stereotypes that simultaneously points to issues of character and appearance. The horsehair trope signals a wildness of character and to the appearance of dark, unruly hair, of course, also to false hair, like weave. She links herself to an animal. This is something that white people have done to black people for centuries, colonialism. Next, she admits that she admired white people's hair. And finally, we get to the point that straight hair would help her fit in and not have to deal with being a marginalized person in a majority white society. Then she addresses her lips. She says that she tries to squeeze her lips together. Another aspect of black appearance that has been stereotyped through visual culture, famously characterized in racial imagery from the colonial period to the present. She describes making her lips thin to resemble white German lips. However, the adjective that she uses is puffy, which is also a descriptor of hair. Again, she repeats the phrase, doing all of this desiring to minimize the microaggression she receives, and then, of course, likening fitting in to beauty. Hairstyling can provide emotional support for fictional Afro-German protagonists. I'd like to analyze the impact of hair in the film using Brenwan Opako's Tal der Ahnungslosen. This film features a black East German woman who is in search of her birth mother. We see her as she moves into her apartment in Dresden. After an uneventful trip to the Stasi archive, the protagonist, Eva, meets another black woman, Julia, on a bridge. Because it's raining, the black woman shares her umbrella with Eva and says, "Na, hast du deinen Regenschirm vergessen?" And anyway, the conversation goes on, and I have it here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of spring forward a little bit. But the black stranger basically provides stranger for Eva after a very overwhelming and unsatisfying trip to the Stasi archive to find information about her mother. And Eva compliments the black woman's hair, which I also realized later I did my hair the exact same way from the woman on the bridge. Maybe that was subconscious, I don't know. But this is what her hair looks like. And Julia says that she could do it for her. This conversation in the film is striking because Eva meets someone unassociated with her search for her birth mother, or a coworker, right? Julia is practically a stranger. However, there is intimacy in their interaction. Meeting this other black woman sparks the topic of hair immediately, and Julia provides a glimpse at the possibility of friendship. Later, Eva finds the address of her birth mother, shows up to her home, and sees her half-sister arguing with the mother. Frustrated about the timing and unable to insert herself into the scene, Eva flees. Hitting the dash with yellow flowers, she drives away. Crying, Eva calls her new acquaintance, Julia, to do her hair. This hair scene is touching for several reasons. First, Eva goes to Julia after a frustrating encounter with her birth family. The failed connection to them leads her to reach out to Julia, another black woman in town. While she's still crying, Eva asks for more than hair care. In the next scene, we see a hot comb on the stove. And doing hair in the kitchen is significant because, of course, it's necessary to heat up the hot comb on the stove, but also it's a place where black mothers have done their black children's hair for generations. And of course, Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde have talked about the kitchen space as being a space particularly empowering for black women. Second, unable to receive motherly love and care, Eva gains it from Julia. In this scene, the film cuts between the straightening of Eva's natural hair and the package of documents she sent to her birth mother, and of course its journey via the Deutsche Post. The viewer follows the package of Eva's story travel, and simultaneously the viewer witnesses Eva being cared for and transformed in another way, through hair. In truth, Julia only straightens her hair and does not create the double bun hairstyle that Julia had herself on the bridge. From the smoke of the hot comb fills the kitchen, and Julia opens up the window, which of course is funny if you've ever experienced that firsthand. And we see Eva looking unsatisfied, which again gives black viewers another flashback to their childhoods about being unsatisfied when their mothers are doing their hair in the kitchen. But we can see that Julia was unable to give Eva the fulfillment that she needed. Her attempt to straighten her hair was less about an effort to fit in. It's more about a desire to forge a connection with someone to establish fictive kinship. Ava was not worried about being inconspicuous. Instead, she wanted to be more like the Black woman she met on the bridge, so this is a different moment from the other earlier moments of trying to fit in. In a flashback in the orphanage, Ava puts on a yellow knit hat with long braided ear flaps. These strings resemble two pigtails. Young Ava puts on the hat and twirls in front of the mirror and admires her new hair. The nun in the orphanage tells her to take off the hat and line up with the other girls, but of course Ava wants to keep it on. And the more aggressively, the nun tells her to take it off again, and Ava claims that this hat is her hair. The other girls giggle, and of course Ava is punished. This scene is important because, again, this flashback shows the significance of long blonde hair and the desirability of it for the protagonist. In a film about family, these hair scenes are important moments that speak to sense of self, identity, and acceptance during various points of Ava's life. Her hair was key to that. While the film is about familial connection and telling truth about the past, there are many significant scenes and moments that revolved around hair that exemplify the common experiences of Black Germans. As a final example, the Deutsche Welle film Afro-Deutschland also focuses on hair. The short film begins with close-ups of the Black German journalist Jana Preiges washing her hair. After it's dry, she straightens it. Her voice starts the video documentary saying, "Das Bild, das Deutsche weiß sind, blond sind und blaue Augen haben. Das stimmt ja nie und das wird nie stimmen. Das ist ein Mythos." Preiges travels to Hamburg to meet her old friend, Black German hip-hop artist and producer Sammy Deluxe. They discuss their multiracial background and the pressure they feel from others who ask them what it's like to be hin und her gerissen between two cultures, to which Preiges says it's just a normal state of being. Sammy Deluxe explains that his straight hair caused him a fair amount of confusion. Kids called him the N-word but took it back, commenting on his straight hair. In his case, hair is the singular signifier of Blackness. And in the rest of the film, I don't have it here, I kind of cut it for time, but in the rest of the film, she goes to an afro shop to get her hair done, and she gets her natural curls back, and she speaks to Esther Duncourt of Krauselocke, which is the blog, and she wears her natural hair for the rest of the film, so she kind of goes through this process on screen. In this paper, I've shown how hair is a significant marker for race for many Afro-Germans. From the Third Reich to the present day, Black Germans speak out against white beauty standards, specifically the myth of blonde straight hair. I've examined many examples from multiple sources to show that these seemingly slight moments, when added together, offer a strong statement about how important hair was for their formative years and beyond. Across genders and generations, there is a notion of needing time to process the fact that straight blonde hair is not attainable and it's not beautiful, and eventually finding one's own hair beautiful. Embracing Afro-Locken allows Black Germans to position themselves in a white society, making their presence more visible. With the growing popularity of YouTubers, blogs, physical salons like Ebony and Ivory in Berlin, Black Germans assert that their natural hair is beautiful, leaving white beauty standards behind. Thank you.
And next up, we have Felicia Ajay. Felicia holds a bachelor's degree in social science from Humboldt University, Berlin, where she is currently completing her MA in the same subject, focusing on anti-discrimination in general and anti-racism, gender equality, and migration policies in particular. These are topics that are close to her heart and that she applies in her long-standing activist work. Based in Berlin, she is a member of the Initiative of Black People in Germany, ISD. In that role, she co-organized the first European network meeting of people of African descent in 2014 and represented the organization at various events in Brussels, Vienna, and New York. She expanded her knowledge in the field of anti-discrimination, both on the national and European level, interning at Germany's Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency, as well as the European Network Against Racism in Brussels. Since 2013, Felicia is a research assistant at Humboldt University's Department of Diversity and Social Conflict, where she gathers additional experience in academia. Since 2016, she's an elected member of the Humboldt University Staff Committee, pushing for more inclusive hiring processes and working conditions. Felicia is a fellow of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Humanity in Action. She's lived and worked in Germany, Belgium, South Africa, and speaks German, English, and French. And it's such a pleasure to have you here.
Hello. So in my presentation, I'm spanning a period of roughly 30 years talking about the more recent Black activist work in Germany, starting around 1985 until today. And I call it recent forms of Black activist work or Black political organizing, as Black people's presence in Germany dates back centuries ago, and like all oppressed groups, Black people have always resisted against racism and different forms of oppression, one way or the other. Also, I want to make clear that both past and present Black activist work that I will talk about will only be a selection of projects and initiatives. As a member of the initiative Black People in Germany, ISD, I'm drawing a lot from this organization's history and field of activities, noting that there are many other Black-led organizations like BGHRA, standing for Black Women in Germany, or the Zentralat der Afrikanischen Gemeinde, Central Council of the African Community, and these are also key organizations when thinking about Black political organizing in Germany or Berlin. Yes, so given the conference's topic, I will talk in particular about aspects that to me have a striking transnational dimension to it. And I named the title of my talk, Making Diversity Work and Fight. In order to contextualize Black activism and to know what we are fighting against, I will very briefly first outline racism in Germany in general and anti-Black racism in particular. And I also just want to make a disclaimer that I do not address anti-Black racism coming from other racialized groups, which is hardly talked about in social justice spaces in Germany. Yes, so the denazification policy imposed on Germany by the Allied forces after the Second World War remained on the surface without dismantling or even naming the mechanism, patterns, and structures that led to German Nazi era. Rather, the moral rhetoric was quickly adopted that racism is bad, a disease even. It resulted in racism being made a taboo subject that nobody wants to be identified with, lasting until today. Instead of seeing racism as an inherent and structural element of Germany's society, interwoven with Germany's colonial past, it is framed as a marginal phenomenon, and Germany's colonial history is hardly touched upon. If racism is ever addressed, it refers either to marginal groups such as racist or right-wing extremist groups whose racism is then portrayed as rooted in individualized hatred and stereotypes, or is completely detached from societal structures at large. Making racism a taboo and downplaying its structural character and the racist experience that affected groups make is a strategy to maintaining the status quo and existing power structures. Another strategy to deal or not to deal with racism is its externalization. For the rare occasion when racism is talked about, it is often happening elsewhere and most probably in the US, while highlighting that the few racist incidents in Germany do not amount to racism, and by far the German or the US case cannot be compared, and therefore racism either does not exist in Germany or is portrayed as something exceptional. This goes hand in hand with upholding a colonial amnesia and the fact that Black people are erased from Germany's history. Therefore, Black people are perceived as a new minority, as the newly arrived in Germany, despite Black people's century-old presence. Germany is a country with a dominant narrative, imagining itself as a homogeneously white nation or folk. But what is whiteness really? Whiteness is constructed. Whiteness is a constructed identity that only works in negation and exclusion to the other. That is created to serve this purpose. Therefore, whiteness depends on blackness and the colonial dichotomy between Europe or whiteness being civilized and rational, and Africa or blackness being uncivilized or incapable of rationality. Thus, German is a hostile environment for black people as a visible minority in terms of structures, institutions, day-to-day life. And being black and German, which for me is being a black person in Germany, regardless of her or his citizenship status or nationality, is seen as an impossibility. This explains also why people address me, often very much taking pride in their international competences or English language skills, by addressing me in English. In Berlin, Germany's capital, with an international branding, I'm seen as a foreigner, a tourist, a migrant, regardless of whether or not I was born and raised in Germany, and regardless of the nationality that my passport might convey. Just 2 days ago, I spoke with a friend of mine about how we experience racism in Germany, and she recounted a situation when, as a dark-skinned black woman, she was asked in an interview situation how she identifies herself. When she said that she identifies as an Afro-German person or a black German, the 3 white men interviewing her started laughing. Hearing this really moved me, and it not only shows that being black and German is seen as an impossibility, it is also a laughable matter. And these are just 2 examples of everyday racism. However, these are the same mechanisms for everyday racism that make some bodies being seen more or less valuable than others, more or less worthy of being granted a life and dignity, or even worthy of empathy. Because racism kills not only related to racist attacks, but also when looking at European migrant or containment policies that are highly racialized and that cost the lives of so many people who die on the way to make it to Europe. I assume that response to these human-made tragedies would be different if the people who die because of them were not black or brown. Also, there are nuances of anti-black racism that shape our experiences and do make a difference that needs to be acknowledged within the black community as well. What is often being glossed over is that experiences of anti-black racism are diverse, and although the white gaze has mastered identifying markers of racialized difference, anti-black racism can be different depending on the color of your skin. Whether or not you're a dark-skinned woman or light-skinned woman like me does influence the way you are seen, treated, and partly included, and the way you can navigate through spaces. Yes, with that being said, I now turn to how black political organizing was fueled in the 1980s. So with a long history of anti-black racism in Germany, black people could relate to and learn from the civil rights movement in the US, as well as black theory and literature. However, it was particularly the influence of black feminist thought and the work of Audre Lorde that kickstarted black political organizing in Germany. Audre Lorde, for whom it was important to identify as a black woman, lesbian, poet, mother, warrior, was a visiting professor of literature at Free University Berlin in the early 1980s and drew to her classes many women and feminists. During these classes, she encouraged a group of young black German women of different origins to not leave the room before they had spoken to one another. Some of the women had already been involved in the women's and lesbian movement in Germany. On this, Marion Kraft writes, I quote, "The white feminist movement was neither very concerned about the issue of racism nor interested in works by black women. As a result, the black German women's movement emerged in the 1980s was more connected to black feminists in the United States. The black lesbian writer, poet, and activist Audre Lorde was particularly active in forming transnational bridges," end quote. These women coming together and sharing their experiences was the beginning of a community building process that turned out to be the foundation of different forms of political activism. Peggy Piesche emphasizes the role of a perspective, or better to say, a way to engage with one another, promoted by Audre Lorde in her text on the creative powers of difference. This perspective is centered around learning from and acknowledging the complexities of our lives and giving nuance to the Black experience. It allows to give room for differences and to highlight different aspects of our intersectional lives, shaping our experiences while seeing a common ground for community building and resistance. This was linked to the creation of safe spaces, or better to say, safer spaces, a concept stemming from feminist thought and practice that allowed to exchange experiences and develop support systems, as well as art projects, actions, and campaigns centering a Black perspective. The history of Black political organizing in Germany proves the importance of language both for identity formation and resistance, which is beautifully described in Audre Lorde's famous text, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. Especially the coining of the term afro-German was key to political activism in Germany. Not only was it the first time that Black people could name and identify themselves with a non-derogatory term, also it left enough room for encompassing the differences of the diverse Black or Afro-German community in Germany. This self-definition not only created a collective identity. Moreover, it added to a more politicized language that in turn fueled discussions as well as political mobilization. These processes and work of Black lesbian women in particular led to the formation of several organizations such as ADEFRA, Afro-German Women, or Black Women in Germany, and the ISD, Initiative for Black People in Germany. That was in 1985 or 1986. Many projects and initiatives followed with the establishment of the Black History Month, the publication of books and magazines such as Afrikete or Afrolook, or the first demonstration against racism organized by Black people in Berlin in 1991 in the context of a spike in racist sentiments and attacks in the wake of Germany's reunification. And this was just to name a few examples. I want to especially highlight the book Farbe bekennen, showing our colors by Maya Yim and Katharina Oguntoye. It was published in 1986 and showcased the lives and experiences of Afro-German women spanning several generations. It was a key contribution to the rewriting of German history. And on this, Sasha Sinflu points out that the blank page of knowledge on Black people's history and presence in Germany also offered a possibility for Black people to narrate their own stories, following an understanding that the reclaiming of Black history is a form of resistance itself that challenges the dominant narrative of Germany being a homogeneously white nation. Also, it challenged the dominant perception that racism did not exist in Germany, downplaying the experience, complaints, and testimonies made by racialized groups in Germany. There were workshops, readings, and exhibitions around the book throughout Germany, which then supported the coming together of Black people and other racialized groups. The book also validated my own experience in Germany and finally gave me the vocabulary to talk about racism when I read it at the age 22. I grew up in a predominantly white environment in Bielefeld, a relatively big city in the northwest of Germany, with a very small Black population at that time. So 20 years after this book was published, I had to actively seek this knowledge and kind of look for my own, for vocabulary to talk about my own experiences. But what does that mean, actually? It shows that this knowledge is still marginalized and that mainstream society is resilient against it. Basically, it shows that we still have a long way to go. And this was just a very brief description of the German context. And fast forward to today's context and work, and building on what I just presented, much work continues to be done in different areas, such as decolonizing the public space or the fight against racial profiling and police brutality. I also do not want to simply list different areas of activist work that would focus heavily on the ISD and leave out other organizations' work. If people are interested in that, we can talk maybe afterwards about that. Rather, I thought of what exactly the transnational dimensions of Black political activism aimed at combating racism and intersecting forms of discrimination affecting people in Germany could be like. And also while preparing this talk, I thought a lot about how I should describe it. I first wanted to say that resistance has become more transnational, but then, for example, looking at Audre Lorde's impact on Black political organizing in Germany, I realized that it has always been transnational or transnationally influenced. So what I think is more accurate is that apart from transnational connections and influences in a globalized world, there is an increased effort to create transnational networks operating at the European level. For example, in 2014, the first European network meeting for people of African descent was held in Berlin, bringing together activists from different Black activists from 15 European countries. And that led then to the formation of the European Network of People of African Descent, NPAD, consisting of Black-led self-organizations throughout Europe. And the aim is to jointly address anti-Black racism and taking into account different national contexts as well. Moreover, the European Union and international structures and institutions are increasingly used by Black anti-racist lobbyists. They are using different channels, such as working with members of the European Parliament and organizing hearings within the European Parliament or the European Commission to address anti-Black racism and to push forward their demands. Just last week, I attended the first ever People of African Descent Week that was held in the European Parliament, and it also brought together activists, members of the European Parliament, and policymakers from the local, national, and European level in an effort to push for a pan-European approach to tackle anti-Black racism. And also while being aware that the European Union plays a key role in maintaining European continental racism, when looking at its migration policies, for example, Black civil society organizations are using these European Union structures and referring to the legally binding anti-discrimination directive. So this can be seen as a necessary strategy to create supranational pressure onto nation states, given their lack of political will to tackle racism. And this is also a necessity in that racism and anti-Black racism are European phenomena, and that right-wing and racist movements throughout Europe are also increasingly working together across borders. So given that we don't have time, I would just... Okay, okay. So then also the conversation that I just had with a friend of mine 2 days ago also made me rethink this presentation, and I also wanted to highlight the aspect of conflict and power dynamics within Black activist spaces in Berlin, which is the context where I come from. And as Black people are very diverse when talking about and when talking about Black activism, the same questions regarding who is speaking for whom arise. Gender, class, disability are also important dimensions which are often not addressed or not taken into account within social justice spaces. And also the aspect of colorism is at play when thinking of who's able to talk, who's heard, and whose knowledge is out there for a long time already, but when do we start listening to it? Yeah, so in general, I think we have to ask ourselves how that this class and colorism remain a big challenge for anti-racist and all emancipatory movements at large, but are necessary to make differences work and fight for everyone. Thank you.
I'm glad you took the time to make that final point. Yeah. I think it's going to be important for our discussion. So finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Melba Joyce Boyd. She is a distinguished professor in African American Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit and an adjunct professor in Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. An award-winning author or editor of 13 books, 9 of which are poetry, over 100 essays, and a documentary filmmaker. She is the recipient of the Independent Publishers Award, twice awarded the Library of Michigan Notable Books Award for Poetry, finalist for the NAACP Image Award and the Four Award for Poetry, as well as the Nonfiction Award from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Boyd's poetry and over 100 essays and creative nonfiction have appeared in anthologies, academic journals, cultural periodicals, and newspapers in the United States and Europe. She has a Doctor of Arts in English from the University of Michigan, an MA and a BA in English from Western Michigan University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joyce Boyd.
So, good afternoon. It's been really inspiring conference, and I always get excited when I hear the young scholars. I can call you young because I'm old. I'm going to depart from presenting a paper per se. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about my experience as a Fulbright professor at University Tate Bremen, 1983-84, and what was particularly unique for me personally, and also what was unique about that moment, I think, globally, in terms of what was happening between the United States, Allied forces, and the Soviet Union. So first of all, I want to indicate how I ended up going to Germany, because it just kind of happened. I did not study German. I knew no German until I got to Germany. I had studied French, Latin, but what happened was a friend of mine had been a Fulbright scholar in Italy, and when he returned to Detroit, I was saying, wow, you know, I really would like to spend some time in Europe. And he said, well, he says, I suggest, he said, Italy was really great. He says, but I also gave this talk. I was invited to Bremen, and they're looking to bring someone to the university there who is a person of color, but a person who is a non-traditional scholar. They wanted someone who was also possibly a creative person, as he was. He was also a creative writer as well as a scholar. So he gave me these two names, one of which was Dieter Herms, and he said, write to Dieter and tell him your interests, and also a professor in Italy. So as I was going through this process, I was then received a position as a visiting professor at the University of Iowa. And over the course of time, I got the letter. But I had a professor at the University of Michigan, Professor Rudolf Arnheim. And he's famous for being one of the first scholars to write about film as art. And he was also German Jewish and had to leave during that horrific period in German history, went to Italy, and then eventually ended up in the United States. And he encouraged me to go to Germany. And I was really sort of surprised, you know, at his suggestion. And he said, because of the way that you think and because of your work, he says, I think you'll be more appreciated in Germany. I'm like, oh, well, okay. So he was smarter than me, so I took his advice, and I did get an invitation from the Fulbright Commission to go to Bremen. Now, what's also important is that, number one, I knew nothing about Bremen, but it was the perfect place for me to go. I was born and raised in Detroit, came of age, during the 1960s. I was active in the student activism movement. 1968, we had a student demonstration after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and we made our demands upon the university to establish Black Studies at the university, and also to provide scholarships and funds for economically challenged persons of color, which also not just Black students, but also students of color who could not afford to go to university, which meant we also brought in a large number of Chicano students, because we're in the western part of the state there, where there were large populations that had come for migrant work and had settled in Michigan. So, that whole movement and the movement against this, the anti-war movement, that was all a part of my college experience, and, asserting for women's rights and so on and so forth. So, all that being said, I end up in Bremen, and I run into a whole generation of what they call 68ers. And I realized that I was a 68er. And the conversations and interactions, also, Bremen is Frei Hansestadt Bremen. It's a free city-state, and it has this amazing history of wanting to remain independent. They had a revolution in 1848 because they didn't want to be a part of Germany. When Hitler was elected, they declared themselves independent again, and Hitler had to send in troops to occupy Bremen because he wasn't having it. But it was just a really, really interesting place to be. And also, since I was born and raised in Detroit, we're talking about a city, of course, at this point, that is predominantly Black. We had just, not too few years ago, had elected a mayor who had been a known communist socialist. It's a city with a very strong civil rights and also labor rights history. So the whole attitude of or the intersection between race and class, as we were talking earlier today, is a big part of the time that I grew up in. We'll talk about the new Detroit later, but during this time, the 1980s, we're talking about a place that was really in the forefront of Black struggle in the United States. So I get to Germany, and the first thing I got to do, of course, is learn how to speak some German. So they sent me to the Goethe Institute, and I'm really struggling. And so and also I'm connected to Broadside Press. There's some mention of Audre Lorde. I knew Audre Lorde. We published her poetry. Broadside Press was an independent publishing house out of Detroit that was founded by Dudley Randall, who was my mentor. And so I write him, I'm like, this German is not working. My head is just going crazy. And he said, go and read some German poetry, and he says, and try to translate. And that was really what I needed, was to go back to feeling and language the way that a poet, feels in language. But also, the other thing was, I was really upset because I knew that the Cold War was coming to an unfortunate head, possibly in Germany. But the thing is, when you're in the United States and they're talking about these issues, you don't see what you see when you're in that space. Like in the United States, even though Trump wants to do this, he wants to have a military parade, you probably heard some of that madness. That's not something that they do in the United States. So you don't see tanks and all of this. So all of a sudden, I'm in Germany, and I'm like, oh my God, there were tanks, on trains, there were just everything. It was just absolutely, you knew you were in a war zone. So they send me to Rothenburg up to Tauber. Yeah, everybody's nodding their heads and over the way. And it's medieval town to learn German. And so what I started doing is really writing poetry, because I had to filter all of this anxiety and confusion I was feeling. So what I'm going to do is read some poems and then try to contextualize and to understand what's happening here. So this first poem that I wrote, that is it's mostly in English, but there's some German phrases, because I started noticing things, and when I would hear people say stuff, I would write it down, and I'd ask someone who was much better in German, what did this person just say? And then they would tell me, and I write it down. And so this is how I started learning German. So this poem is entitled Wingless Spiders. Helicopters hover over Rothenburg ob der Tauber. A one-armed veteran points at the hour. Herr Bürgermeister, Sie müssen ein Krug Bier trinken, was wir der Drickster Weltkrieg bringen. Green poems are written in blue violets, striping amber. Skeleton's signature, the sidewalks of Bremen. Wir waren dafür, jetzt sind wir tot, was wir der nächste Krieg bringen. In city basements, subway stations, bus stops, and midnight hangs, with their hands in their pockets, they wait. From under America, they climb into flat uniforms like stuffed olives to be served with the limited nuclear war. For blue-eyed children with shaved heads and pierced ears, soldiers bring suitcases singing in black English. The soul is gone, the spirit is split, the mark ain't worth 25 cents. Party today, die tomorrow, can't even buy a proper stone marker. We will be bagged, tagged, and zipped in see-through heavy-duty plastic. Whisper to Jesus. It was in Rothenburg. I also ran into a black American soldier, and he introduced me to a young woman who was a black German. And I was thinking about that today, because when we started talking, and she was very quiet, and he introduced me to her, and he said, she's German. He didn't say she was black German. She said we're German. But he knew that I knew that she was black, right? And that was interesting, because she was very shy. But it was my introduction to that. Now, my father had actually fought in World War II and was in Germany, and he fought in Patton's troops, which meant they were the troops that went in to liberate POW camps. And so he actually spent time in Germany after the war was over. And so he had, encounters with ordinary German citizens. And so he had a much broader perception of who the German people were. And he was also encouraged me to go to Germany. And so that was another sort of insight that I took with me. So when I get to Bremen, I'm supposed to teach at Bremen, and I get there and I begin to meet all these different people, and I also meet a Native American brother, and he's a blues musician. Now, the other thing that's interesting when I get to Germany, there's like so much American culture everywhere, but there's a lot of black culture, especially in Bremen. Bremen at that time, I don't know if it's still true, was the headquarters for the Green Party. And there's just like jazz. I mean, you go into a kneipe, like you can hear Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye. I mean, it is just amazing to me how prevalent Black American culture is, and also how well-read especially persons in my generation and younger, how much Black American literature. I mean, they read more Black American literature than most of the folks in my neighborhood back in Detroit. And we're having these kinds of conversations, and they're not professors, they're just well-read, students of literature. And so it's just, I feel really at home in a lot of ways, culturally, politically, and then I'm being connected to the poetry community and to the music community, because I also used to play a little jazz myself. And I perform with jazz musicians oftentimes. And so I'm really getting into my groove there. And I meet Curtis, and Curtis he's playing blues at this particular place. And we get to be really close friends. And this is a poem that I wrote for Curtis, and it's called Blues Music Sky of Morning. Nobody knows the Indian in the photograph, overlooking the blonde ones sinking around bottle rings in St. Polyeka. Jurgen, who hums my grandmother's hymns, takes me to Curtis, my Cherokee cousin of the skylight eyes, who lays the blues on a piano with a broken hand. In the other, I place the Muskogean alphabet, lost on the trail of tears that separated our ancestors for 141 years. I am Blue Jay of the Amber Eyes. I wear Italian moccasins from Berlin and braided leather from Bremen. Sky Eyes remembers to part his hair, centered with temporal gravity. Encircling smoke inside Kyrene's garden, we drink Ugandan coffee of California smiles. In the distance, the cavalry teases the angry bear at the border. We listen. The earth is a mosaic of cryptic symmetry, chanting in the blues music sky of morning. Finally, I've been there a few months, and our German's getting better. It's going to be worse when I read this poem, but you'll have to forgive me. It's been a couple of years since I've been to Bremen. And this is, understand there's all kinds of demonstrations because they're bringing in these Pershing to cruise missiles, what they call short-range, mid-range nuclear weapons. Now, anybody who's had any science knows there's no such thing as limited nuclear explosion. Once it's out, it's gone, right? So we're protesting in the Marktplatz. I'm wondering, am I ever going to get to teach my class? And we're like, no, this is Bremen. We're going down and we're demonstrating. And it is overwhelming. And so this poem is written after I've been in Germany for about 6 months. And it's a combination of both German and English. To write the 13th Flamingo, I flew from Detroit to Bremen to stand on one leg and wonder. Soon, Germans haben mich gefragt, wie gefällt es Ihnen in Deutschland? Und ich habe gedacht, es gefällt mir rot, weiß und blau, wie ein amerikanisches Drama, with black and brown soldiers drinking Coca-Cola, escorting General Blackjack Pershing reincarnated as a missile through the Black Forest under Sauer Reagan, to wait for Rotkäppchen mit Kermit Cole. Aber ich habe gesagt, vielleicht es ist der unentwundeste amerikanische Bundesstaat. Doch, das ist Europa, nicht Amerika. Doch. Habe ich nicht Dallas im Fernsehen geguckt? Habe ich nicht Grandmaster Flash auf der Berliner Mauer gelesen oder Breakdance auf einer Hamburger und einer Frankfurter Straße gesehen? Kommen Sie aus Amerika? Nein, ich komme aus der nächsten Welt, die mit der Rot, Weiß und Schwarz verbunden ist. Und warum sind Sie hierher gekommen? Ich habe meinen Urgroßvater in Weiß gesucht, aber ich habe das andere Deutschland gefunden, in Rot und Grün, und wir haben unter einem Stern zusammengesessen und dieses Buch gemacht. Thank you.
So I'd like to welcome all three of you back to the stage, Jamel, Osadeh. Melba, we have about 15 minutes for discussion, which would allow another 10 minutes of coffee discussion so we can continue outside, but I'd like to open it up to questions.
I'd like to ask all three of you, given the fact that for sure the existence of black Germans is something now Germany has to deal with, how long do you think before black Germans will be a really viable political force? Politics, the way we think of politics, affecting laws.
Yeah, actually, this is a question I cannot really answer because to become a political force, to be a political force, well, we are a minority, and so I don't really know if it's. I'm wondering what we would have to do in order to be a political force. Should we change our strategy? Should we do something different? But I think then I would then focus more on majority society, because it also depends on if we're talking about racism. As like for anti-racist work, I think Black people have already and Black political organizing have already played a crucial part in making racism a topic in itself, because it used to be a taboo, and now things are getting a bit better in the way that we can now have at least discussions around racism a little bit. But I'm not really sure what are the criteria to be a political force? Because as I already said, the things we're saying now, that we're talking about racism, this is actually something that has been going on for decades already. And I'm not quite sure what needs to be changed. And I think it's rather the majority population that kind of, and its resilience against anti-racist work that are determinants for whether or not we can be a force, because resistance has always existed and will always exist. Yeah.
I'm trying to think how to ask this question. And I think it's about chronology or temporality or something like that. So I was very moved by the way, Melba, by the way your poem ended. Ich habe das andere Deutschland entdeckt in Rot und Grün. Now, I'm in 68 or 2, so that's part of the reason it moved me. But that's the year before Audre Lorde was there, and the moment at which the Black German movement emerged. And so I'd be interested in people talking about how what seemed to be the other Germany in red and green, how it failed the Black German movement, or how it refused to address issues, both the left and Greens, how race hasn't been a significant enough dimension or aspect of that politics. And maybe that would be something you could answer from an ISD.
Yeah, no, I can't answer that question. But I was actually there the same time that Audre was there. And we gave a reading. German American Studies Association had a conference in Berlin in the spring of '84. And Audre was teaching at the Universität at the same time. And actually, I was there for some days, and I, met with Audre and her students. And I don't know, I think that in terms of the failure of the movement, because I've only gone back and forth. I do know when I go back to Bremen, where I'm in Frankfurt or visiting old friends or speaking or whatever, that they feel that the things have changed and not necessarily did not go in the direction they wanted it to go. And I'm not a political scientist, and I haven't really, studied all of the dimensions of those shifts. But I think certain things have happened in Germany itself. I felt like, or it seemed as if politics were more progressive when Germany was split into East and West. And I found that the persons who were active, who viewed themselves as socialists or viewed them part of the Green Movement, they were much more critical, and they actually were much more of issues around race and so forth. But, you know, like you say, it's temporality, right? I mean, things have changed. You know, we know that well, just in terms of more recent events in the United States. So I'm not really sure. I can't really give you an answer for why. But I think that we've seen sort of a slack in kind of across the board as far as that's concerned. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, because it's 50 years, 68, and at least in Europe, there's a lot of programming around this idea of 68, and many people are jumping on this Decolonize 68, and I'm part of a project that's called Decolonize 68, and I have, 8 months to try and decolonize 68. And whenever I'm asked about it, what I say is, how can you decolonize 68 if we haven't decolonized 2018? So I think that it is a question of temporality, that the past is in this present and the future is also in this present, and there are many people in this room who work on Afrofuturism, like Priscilla Lane, and this is, I think, especially for the Black experience, very much true. So we have another question from the audience. Kavina.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering, this question is for Felicia. Yeah, did I butcher that? I'm sorry. And you mentioned that colorism and anti-Black racism within other racialized communities in Germany is a subject that hardly comes up in social justice spaces. And I was wondering why you think that is and where the conversation is now. Because I often wonder, this idea of when are we becoming a political force? I think it's not necessarily our job to fix racism, right? But do you feel like the conversation has evolved in terms of colorism within the Black German community or ISD, and how are the connections being drawn to other racialized communities, and how are we fighting within the ISD at least this idea of anti-Black racism from other racialized groups?
So I think in general in Germany, it's a bit difficult having conversations within racialized communities, because we are racialized and we are minorities, and then it's also this thing that we want to fight racism, and then there's this assumption that we have to stick together. I mean, there's solidarity is necessary, but then having conversations about discrimination, different forms of discrimination, talking about gender or class, ableism, is difficult to have, but then specifically within anti-racist social justice spaces by racialized communities itself and members of racialized communities, it's a very difficult topic, and I think we haven't found really a solution yet on how to deal with it. Because for once we are working towards the same goal, but then how do we get there? This is the big question. In general, we're always coming to political mobilization. And yeah, I think it's more, for now, it's more like a pragmatic stance that
it's like, yeah, we have to be, I mean, this identity creation, formation in general of who is that, how are we, how do we come to be a we? We should and have to work together, we have to be in solidarity with each other, but what is being addressed, who, and also, yes, as I said, the power dimensions, I feel are often not talked about because there's also, yeah, even now I'm struggling to find words because it's so difficult. But then thinking of how anti-blackness is not addressed coming from different communities is often, not only is it not talked about, but it's kind of, it kind of, well, thinking of the solutions is like we're trying to work in coalitions and have strategic alliances with different organizations, both racialized communities as well as majority society organizations, and then colorism within the ISD or Black social justice spaces in general. There are some efforts to talk about it, but I don't really think it's happening yet. Yes.
Could continue on this. In America, the largest, or no longer the largest, minority group or racialized group were African Americans. Now it's the Latinx community. In Germany, it's clearly not the afro-germans, it's the Turks. And I'm curious, what's the relationship between those two communities, and now that you took in 1 million Syrians, that's another huge racialized group. So and they're brand new. So I'm curious about what that is. You seem to be talking around. I'm wondering what it looks like there between those groups.
Yes, okay, trying to think about the answer and if I really have an answer to this. So in general, I think, yes, now it's many, in the so-called refugee crisis, there are many people seeking asylum seekers and refugees in Germany, but what I see more is that the kind of discussions that we have are the same. So it's always about the newly arrived, and so of course we have to be in solidarity with each other and support each other. But also I think that what is now a big challenge is that the whole issues of racism now is framed as a topic within migration, and not as part as German society at large. And of course, different forms of racism, anti-migrant sentiments and policies have to be addressed, and we have to work together. But what I really think is that now it's about this whole integration discourse that we continue to have every 5 years, and yeah, and how yeah, I mean, also within then the the refugees, there are different. So there are a lot of people from Syria, but then now it's now then when talking about how I'm sorry, I think I kind of lost my.
That's
Yeah.
actually, I would say I really invite everyone to stay for Fatima Al-Tayyib's talk after the break, because and I can't read the future, I don't know what you're going to talk about, but in knowing your book Undeutsch, you talk about this as well, and this idea of the different hierarchy between refugee claimants. You know, the idea that an economic refugee claimant, which is, you know, often people who are coming from the continent of Africa, are sort of considered lower than refugees coming from war-torn countries, that there's this kind of hierarchy. And even further than that, also this idea of what you were trying to get to of like always being brand new, always trying to reinvent this story as if it's just arriving, whereas it's been a story. And that's, I think, also great about this panel. We're talking about really 3 different time periods. So the early 80s, and then when you're speaking about Bram Okpako's film, we're talking, you know, about the 90s, and you're giving us the present day, but we're seeing these same kind of topics coming up again. So I would ask a question, maybe again, bring it back to colorism, what Kavina brought up, and hair, because I think, you know, with this natural hair movement, this is also kind of a topic in terms of colors, because black hair is almost as diverse as diverse as black skin, and there is also a fetishism of a type of black natural hair. And I wonder if you could speak about that and your project, maybe in conjunction with like YouTube videos and self-care.
Yeah, in another form of this paper, the longer form of this paper, I go into a specific YouTuber called Johanna's Essentials. That's her channel. And she is fair-skinned. She's from Cologne and has those big curls that, again, like the closer you are to whiteness is then the more desirable you are. And so that equates also to hair and skin color. And so her channel is very popular, and I know that's also part of it. And other YouTubers who are darker and who do have other curl patterns have talked a lot about the discrimination in between viewership, and then have had to move on. And like Francesca Ramsey is one person who did a lot of lock tutorials and other types of videos, and now she's kind of, you know, moving on to other spheres. And so it seems like those people end up stopping for whatever reason and aren't really continuing, or continue doing something else, like being a makeup guru then, or being something else. And so that's definitely a huge problem. And what I thought was interesting with Sammy Deluxe is that here we have someone who is black but has straight hair, and that though he wasn't teased, or the teasing was kind of taken back from him, then I guess I can't call you the N-word, but that these kids are like trying to process his hair and like these signifiers of blackness that don't quite add up for him. And so it's all very interesting to think about, again, the projections, which we've been talking about, projections that are put on you, and then also what people are willing and wanting to consume. I will, though, say, though, Johanna's Essentials, what she does is has other people with other curl patterns on her channel, and have videos completely with them where they completely speak, and where she's off screen and it's just about them. So that's also something that she tries to do to increase self-love about, you know, your own curl pattern. And then she also will have men on too, and talk about men's hairstyling and men's curl patterns. So I think that those are attempts and signals to try to recognize that and promote self-love.
It's interesting that this, we have another question here, that this, you know, showing your curls is then considered an embodiment of resistance. I was just forced to watch a bit of the Miss America pageant with my mom, or the Miss USA pageant, and the woman from last year, you know, she came on stage and she was like, now I'm wearing my curls. And it was really such a big deal that she was wearing her hair natural. So of course we turned it off when the last black contestant was voted off. Is there a question over here? Oh, great.
I guess it's me. On that same topic, thank you, Jamel, for that. So much to think about. I was wondering what you thought, if you could talk a little bit more about the Yana Paragis film. I think I'm getting her name right, because I saw it, and I you know, my subjective judgment was that she comes across as really superficial to me. And you know, I'm wondering if you could give your own critical reading. I know it's kind of putting you on the spot, or if you could talk about how that was received in, this might be really impossible to answer, but if you could talk about how it was received in Germany, or if there was kind of a follow-up to that, like was this a watershed moment and so on, or was it in any, even in some way, did it generate some interesting conversations? Because she kind of has good hair, right? If I'm not mistaken. I think I've only seen it once, right? But she can have those loose curls. And she comes across as kind of, I mean, from a sort of critical point of view, I feel like she's problematic. She's a problematic figure in Black Germanness. So I'm wondering if you can just tell us anything about that.
Yeah, I did have to watch it a few times to kind of get interested in the film. I am also based in the United States, so I don't know about the German reception of the movie, but maybe other people can speak to that. But she does go to ISD, and she is part of that community, so that also kind of informs how I think that she's trying to take it, and speaking to a lot of different activists within the film. Like there were moments, like there was an attempt. You know, it's a 45-minute documentary that I initially watched because I wanted to use something in the classroom, right? So that was also my whole even desire to do is like, I'm teaching German 300, let me, what can we want, you know? So what I though just found so interesting was this kind of transformation of wearing her hair straight and being this Deutsche Welle journalist, and then, you know, in the middle of the film, you know, going to this Afro shop, and which is also a contested space and a space where you can buy also bleaching creams and relaxers and all of these other types of things, but that she does learn about it, or you know, is looking at the shampoos at least, and is this acted, like how much, like how stylized is this performance? But I think it's an attempt to declare this type of hair beautiful, and as you say, she does have a specific curl pattern, definitely, and I definitely see that, and I'm so struck though that she still straightened her hair the whole time, because it doesn't take a lot for her hair to become straight. But again, it's, you know, talking about these white beauty standards, talking about being on TV all the time and what is consumable for viewers. I think that she's like playing with a lot of that type of tension in her career, and then also throughout the film, and bringing out these like absences and secrets in multiple different ways through other activists and other artists that she talks to. So I'm trying to be generous in yeah.
We have time for one last question or remark.
Yeah, I guess, is this on? Yeah. I mean, I guess I would be generous, because I think, I mean, in her job, that is radical. And I guess that, you know, this comes back to this question that I have, and I'm saying this as a mom of Black children, this, you know, the ways in which I feel like the Black community sort of decides who can and who can't be Black is always like, oh, this is affecting my babies. And so I look at it as an outsider, but I think if you're on TV, it is really radical to straighten your hair in Europe and show your hair that way. And I was also, I mean, I find your work and Jamel on hair really fascinating, and this notion of self-love, and that it's so much more difficult in Germany because the products aren't available the way they are here. You have to make your own. And these house guests that I had who are active in the ISD they went to Walmart when they were visiting us, and they got all these products, and they were just like, I can't believe it's so cheap, and we have all these products, and they bought them. And then, interestingly enough, an African-American man came up to them and asked them who they were and where they were from, and asked them if they were Black. And he said, well, and then they said, what do you think? And he said, well, one of you is more mixed than the other. So they were sort of embracing this Blackness, and he was telling them that they weren't really Black, they were mixed. And so it was this really interesting moment of identity formation and identity denial. But I wonder if you, in your work, do you deal with just the availability of products and how much more work it is to have natural hair?
Yeah, in the longer version of this paper, Johanna's Essentials, also she talks about going to Rossmann, and that now they sell Cantu, the Cantu products at Rossmann. I don't know if they sell them at DM, but so that's a natural hair brand that's kind of, I mean, I don't know how natural the products is and how many chemicals are in the product, but yeah, but she does talk about when she does different product reviews, like this is available if you go on Amazon.uk, or if you're in England, this is available here, this is available in Germany, and this you can go to the Afro shop and buy this one. And so she's very deliberate about getting people access to different products and where they can find them, which I also find very useful and practical information, because like even when I was studying abroad there 2 years, I was like, you know, like I couldn't find makeup, I couldn't find anything for my hair, you know, so that type of information is needed, and relaying that information, right? Like how do we, and I think that gets to also what you were saying, is like, how do we relay this knowledge and pass it on and make sure that people are getting access to this knowledge, right? And it's not just dying and then you find it when you're 22, when you know, right? We could have used all of this knowledge earlier too, so.
Please join me in thanking our guests. This was really... And we have about 10 minutes for a little coffee break, and I urge you to please be on time back here at 3:30 for our keynote. Thank you.
the new adapter thing for me?
Yes. So it's not very long.
Okay.
That end comes up.
And I am going to assert, despite the fact we are pressed for time, I'm going to assert the privilege of my longevity and say a little bit more about how wonderful Fatima is before she gets to talk herself. So I'm entirely honored and delighted to introduce my friend Fatima El Tayeb to you. If I were really to detail all of her scholarly, creative, and activist accomplishments, it would take longer than the talk she's going to deliver for us. But I can begin to outline them for you by telling you about the many contexts in which I've been fortunate enough to work with her. Though her reputation had preceded her, I believe I first met Fatima at the German Studies Association in 2000, where she presented a paper on a panel on whiteness and German national identity, which I believe was the first ever academic discussion of whiteness within North American German studies. That presentation took place just before the publication of and drew on the insights of Fatima's entirely path-breaking first book, Schwarze Deutsche, Rasse und nationale Identität, 1890 bis 1933, based on her dissertation at the University of Hamburg. But the next time I met Fatima, it was for a rather different, though I guess nonetheless somewhat related reason. In October 2001, she was a guest of honor at the Women in German Conference, which featured the entirely hilarious screwball comedy about Black German lesbians, for which she wrote the script, Alles wird gut. That film wasn't released commercially in North America for copyright reasons, but it can be shown in academic contexts. So I encourage you all to view it and show it to your friends and students, and I can only say that what the world gained when Fatima chose an academic career, it lost in a filmmaker. I almost had an opportunity to work with Fatima as a UMass colleague because in 2001, 2002, she was one of the three top candidates in our history department search. But then, as so often at UMass, there was a budget crisis and the position was lost. But as a kind of consolation prize, I was able to spend time with Fatima in Amherst when she spent spring 2002 as a Copeland Fellow, a kind of artist in residence, at Amherst College, nominated by Christian Rogowski, who was one of the co-organizers of the BGHRA conference at Amherst College in 2013. But then the most wonderful thing happened, very much as a result of Fatima's and our friend Peggy Pisha's wisdom, energy, and initiative. It happened that at the October 2002 conference of the German Studies Association in San Diego, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation was recruiting for its trans-co-op grants, collaborations between U.S. and German academics. Fatima, Peggy, and I went to the Humboldt reception, held in balmy weather next to a swimming pool, drank lots of the free red wine, and by the end of the evening had decided to submit a trans-co-op proposal for a project on Black German studies. Fatima later quipped, and I have often quoted this, that it gave the term Schnapsidee a whole new meaning. Fatima and Peggy discovered that the Volkswagen Foundation also was soliciting grant proposals addressing multiculturalism, so the two of them wrote proposals for both grants, and to our astonishment, we got both of them. As you may know, we organized two conferences on Black European Studies in 2005 and 2006, and a conference on Black German Studies at UMass in April 2006, and I think these were the initiatives that jump-started both Black German Studies in North America and Black European Studies on the continent. It could not have been more of a joy to work on these projects with Fatima, Peggy, and Randolph Oxman, at that point the only Black German faculty member in Germany, whom we recruited to work with us. In the meantime, Fatima was ascending to ever greater heights of accomplishment. She left Amherst College to spend a year as scholar in residence at the University of Tennessee, and then was hired into a tenure-track position in the Department of Literature at the University of California at San Diego, where she's been ever since. There she is a professor of African American literature and culture, affiliated faculty with the Department of Ethnic Studies, and until recently director of critical gender studies. I don't know if Fatima knows this, but I wrote letters of support both for her tenure decision and for her promotion to full professor. And one of the great things about writing such letters is that you have to, or maybe get to is a better way to put it, not only read, but actually study all the candidates' publications so that you can assess them for university committees. So I was fortunate enough to be able to read everything that Fatima had written, sometimes even before it appeared in print. Every one of Fatima's publications has been path-breaking, but I'll only tell you about her books here. Her second book, Queering Ethnicity, Minority Activism in Post-National Europe, 2011, illuminates resistance in the New Europe, focusing on forms of political organizing and cultural production by minorities and the second and third generation of economic and political migrants, showing how these populations claim political agency via cultural performance despite the exclusionary practices directed against them. Of particular importance is this book's refusal to think in national categories. I think we're going to see some more of that. Both pointing out similarities in various European countries' conceptions of self-identity vis-a-vis their own migrants and minorities, and also showing how those groups think translocally by drawing upon similar forms of opposition, most manifest in European minorities' appropriation of hip-hop. That book was also published in German in 2015 as Anders Europäisch, Rassismus, Identität und Widerstand im Vereinten Europa. Her most recent book, Undeutsch, Die Konstruktion des Anderen in der postmigrantischen Gesellschaft, 2016, likewise assumes the marginalized perspective of racialized populations who are constructed as Undeutsch, that is, are conceived not only not to belong to the national community, but even to endanger and destabilize it through their very presence. Meanwhile, Fatima concludes, the majority of German citizens comfortably maintain their ignorance, denying or downplaying structural racism, while simultaneously social violence continues to mount. This book brings a discussion of German and European racism up to the present, particularly by focusing on the instrumentalization of the attack on the Charlie Hebdo offices in January 2015 to demonize all people of Islamic background, and all of this, of course, could not be more timely. I concluded one of my recommendations for Fatima by saying this. This is a quote. I find Professor El-Tayeb to be a scholar of astonishing originality whose work is in the process of transforming a number of disciplines, and I expect similar original and innovative research productivity from her in the future. In some ways, one might even consider Professor El-Tayeb something like Gramsci's organic intellectual. Emerging from the circumstances about which she writes, she advances theoretical models that speak to that situation and assist the population she addresses in elaborating strategies of resistance. Now at this conference about, by, and for Black Germans, we are going to benefit once more from Fatima's insights as she helps us think about other emerging strategies of resistance. So I'm very much looking forward to her keynote address today, which is entitled Beyond the Black Paradigm, Afro-Diasporic Strategies in the Age of Neo-Nationalism. Fatima.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was actually an honor for me to be introduced by one of my longtime partners in crime, and I know it's hard to live up to that, but I'll do my best. Also, many thanks to the organizers, to Angelika, Sarah again, Karina, but most of all, to Rosemary, of course. Also, many thanks to the people who decided to sit in the front to make me feel less lonely here. So what I'm trying to talk about today is what the Black German condition, as you might say, can how it can help us to think through questions that are of global importance right now. And I do think what I'm saying connects quite nicely with all of the presentations before. So hopefully we can have a discussion afterwards that connects the whole day. So I guess we can all agree that Afro-diasporic strategies in response to the global rise of neo-nationalism are urgently needed. Violence, poverty, and displacements are escalating. The notion that wealth should translate to power is becoming increasingly explicit again. The commitment to equal rights and equal access is undermined by a mainstreamed rhetoric of entitlement abuse, special rights, and divisive identity politics. The groups that are accused of these rights abuses, who are frequently the same ones suffering most from the above developments, are framed as outsiders destroying a working system and thus in need to be expelled in order for society to return to the desirable, stable, unified state before they arrived or before they gained rights that they can only abuse. These outsiders are created primarily, though not only, through racialization, often reframing groups that are already present as foreign, fundamentally different, and thus without legitimate claims to participation in and ownership of the society they are part of. Anti-Black racism is a key element in this process. It's ever present from daily aggressions such as white people calling the police on Black folks for sitting in a coffee shop or falling asleep in a dorm, or the FBI deciding to invent the category of Black identity extremists rather than surveying white supremacists, or attacks on African refugees across Europe, or the murder of activists like queer Afro-Brazilian Marielle Franco. Within the West, this move to the right receives heightened attention since Trump's election, but it was already evident in the rise of anti-immigrant parties in Europe over the last decade. At the same time, the left's organized response in both Europe and North America is marred by internal conflicts around so-called identity politics. Within the white left, the demand grows to end the supposed focus on special interests identified with feminist, queer, but especially people of color and Black positionalities. These are held responsible for weakening and dividing progressive movements by neglecting the interests of the majority, aka the forgotten white worker. Therefore, so the reasoning goes, it is high time to recenter the global and universal category class and reject divisive distractions such as gender, sexuality, and race. Around the time of Trump's election, this position was expressed among many others by feminist theorist Nancy Fraser, US progressive hope Bernie Sanders, and European philosopher Slavoj Žižek. And it is perfectly summarized in a call for papers, the German Zeitschrift für kritische Sozialtheorie, Journal for Critical Social Theory, published for a special issue on anti-racism and anti-imperialism last year. And this is the call for papers was published in German and English. This is an excerpt from the English version. The German one is better in conveying the sense of hurt and indignation that the white authors of this call very clearly feel. So if you're interested, it's still online. You can look at that. But the reason, of course, that I quoted here is that the dichotomy between class analysis and so-called identity politics constructed here implies that an anti-capitalist critique does not only not need to attend to analytical criteria such as race and gender, but indeed must not, since they ultimately lead to racism against white people and anti-Semitism, among other things. There is no escape out of this binary trap, and either-or choice is required. While this could be considered a mere continuation of familiar leftist infighting, it also reflects a need to hold on to the theory of color supposedly criticized here, a theory that is part of a white patriarchal identity politics that indeed needs to be named and deconstructed. The special issue on anti-racism and anti-imperialism has been published by now, and ironically, but not at all surprisingly, every single author happens to be white and male, underlining the startling and systemic blind spot the white left and much of white theory maintains with regard to its own identity politics, which of course can be traced back to the Enlightenment, whose supposed waning influence is bemoaned by the editors of the special issue. It produced the white European man as the paradigmatic human and allowed for a continental Marxist theory still ignoring race as a fundamental analytical category, instead viewing it as a particularist distraction from the universally relevant category class, which is ironic since class is deeply racialized in Europe and elsewhere. This not only prevents the left from implementing actually effective anti-racist strategies, but as recent developments have shown, actively undermines people of color-led anti-racist movements. In order to counter progressive white politics and to understand and resist the current dismantling of democratic values, it is important to acknowledge that these values were always aspirational and inclusion was always contested and conditional. Democracies always coexisted with racism, often explicitly, and not only in the pre-Civil Rights Act US, but also in Europe. The model of post-national democracy, the European Union, was conceived of as including Europe's colonial empire subjugated territory. It were the anti-colonial liberation movements of the 1960s that ended this vision, not some kind of European commitment to equality and democracy for non-Europeans. On the contrary, European democracies were built on the wealth and power secured through centuries of racist exploitation. And this is exactly what the triad of race, class, and gender grounded in Black feminist thinking can address, also and especially in the German context. As you all probably know, contemporary Europeans believe themselves to be genuinely colorblind and often claim not to get race, usually after referencing a supposed American obsession with it. But what Europeans perceive as an American obsession with race is the reflection of a fundamental shift in US society in the wake of the civil rights and subsequent liberation movements, forcing legal, social, political, and discursive changes, certainly not ending racism, but fundamentally challenging its normalization, making it speakable, which is something that did not happen in Europe after the Holocaust and decolonization. And the question was raised before why the US, the African-American paradigm is so dominant within the diaspora, and there are a number of reasons. I think that changes brought about by the civil rights movement are very central here and shouldn't be forgotten. Of course, US imperialism is another reason, especially in the German context with a massive presence of the US military. But a third reason, of course, is European imperialism, more specifically colonialism. When I was growing up, anti-colonial struggles were still going on, and they were geographically much closer to me being in Germany than the US situation, but it was much easier to get information about what was going on in the US because of Europe had no interest whatsoever to represent anti-colonial struggles in European territories. What happened instead in Europe after decolonization was the externalization of the history of race and racism. This ongoing racial amnesia was made possible through the erasure of the history of European racism and the history of Europeans of color, making unspeakable processes of internal racialization and the ways in which they are inseparable from the after effects of European colonialism and from neocolonial economic structures that posit racialized communities increasingly as disposable populations. The lived experience of racialized Germans, of course, sharply contrasts with the widespread belief that race is meaningless in Germany, that they quite literally don't see race. The opposite is true. This is obvious, for example, in Afro migrants being targeted by police, and not only recently, that already happened at least, how long ago? Wow, the mid-90s, long time. Anyway, I was still living in Hamburg then, and there was a sort of scandal that led to eventually to the local government resigning due to a whistleblower who confirmed that there was routine and widespread torture of African migrants going on within the Hamburg police system, but not only there, across Germany. German courts also continue to affirm that racial profiling is legal, not only to determine if someone is a criminal, as with the construction of NAFRI, which sounds kind of cute, but isn't. It means North African intensive perpetrator, but also simply in assessing who is German. I lived, before I came to the US, in the Netherlands for quite a while and crossed the border to Germany by train. And it was very obvious that I had to show my passport every time because I was black, even though the cops continued to say they did it because they were doing their jobs. That this is the same thing, that their job actually is to enforce a racialized notion of Germanness or something that they obviously didn't question. But you could say that, in fact, my scholarship is rooted in identity politics, originating in this experience, namely the politics of inhabiting an impossible identity, being a black German. Growing up, it was conveyed to me strongly and constantly that these two things do not go together. As to the why, that was barely an issue. The fact was too obvious to require much of an explanation. If I was black, I couldn't be German. That correlation remained valid even if my claim to have been born in Germany was accepted by my interrogators, who simply continued to inquire where I was really from. This is an experience shared by millions of people of color across Europe. It's part of a rather rigid script that is triggered by the presence of racialized Europeans who all have to go through many variations of this dialogue. This is no coincidence, of course, but part of a larger system of exclusion. The desire to identify where I was really from, I much later understood, because that was, of course, something that started when I was still a small kid, having been taught to be polite to grown-ups, so I actually answered this question over and over again, which is something I wouldn't do now, but the whole point is that this dialogue is practiced as soon as you can respond, and it's repeated until you give the so-called right response. So, well, I can't complain about that because that's my phone, so. So I apologize to myself and all of you. Okay, so what I later understood was that the desire, or almost the compulsion that white people seem to have in asking me this question was referencing an essence that in the eyes of white Europeans is embodied by all those inhabiting these impossible racialized identities, something in us, visible often, though not always on us, that excludes us from Europeanness forever. And probably the most extreme example of that are Roma and Sinti communities who go through this experience for 500 years with no end in sight. The "why are you here, how can you speak my language, where do you really come from" trope creates a discursive but very real paradox, since the true answer, "I am from here," is precisely the one that is not acceptable, as it falls outside of the logically possible, the thinkable, and the speakable. And, to quote Judith Butler, to move outside of the domain of speakability is to risk one's status as a subject. And this is exactly what is happening here. The questioning is a form of disciplining and silencing, not merely a reaction to a situation that violates the dominant logic, but an active attempt at enforcing it, reconfiguring reality along acceptable lines, while projecting the tension produced by this clash of reality and ideology onto the racialized subject. The only way to gain subject status is to accept a subject position imposed by the unmarked white German who holds discursive and material power. That is, this is an interpolation that produces a social positionality. The racialized subject, to reference Butler again, is still constituted by discourse, but at a distance from itself. Because racialized Europeans lack the discursive power to shape this exchange to such an extent that it could cause a radical break by introducing a legible new option, "I am from here," even though I'm not white, that would in effect destroy the existing paradigm. They are kept invisible and mute between the antagonism of native norm and foreign aberration, only able to seemingly become subjects of speech if they take on the false but acceptable identity, that is the identification as a migrant or foreigner. Terms like second and third generation migrants suggest that racialized populations permanently remain aliens from elsewhere, which is a term that I borrow from Ray Chow. This state of being permanently stuck in a temporary condition is characteristic for the discursive framing of racialized communities in Europe in general. It is a framing that justifies and produces the material conditions of exclusion while preventing the acquisition of rights associated with long-term presence, since it does not place this community within the larger space-time of the nation. In fact, the further away the actual moment or movement of migration is, the stronger the paradox that is the queerness of their presence in space and time. The embodiment of seemingly incompatible spaces and identities is the source of their erasure. Racialized Europeans are situated outside of linear progressive time, relegated instead to a heterotopic space of impossibility, which represents the excess of all utopian visions, be they directed at their absolute exclusion from or complete inclusion into the dominant spatio-temporal framework. So heterotopia here in the sense of something that is already there but cannot be imagined because it seems to be in violation of what we consider possible. So in some ways it's the flip side of the utopia, which is something that is not there, but we still have to be able to imagine it based on what we already experience, if that makes sense. As such, this possibility also becomes a site of potentiality, however. It produces new strategies of resistance, which I summarize as the queering of ethnicity, that is a non-essentialist and non-linear political strategy not based on racial identity politics, but on the shared experience of being racialized, potentially resulting in a situational inclusive identity, creating bonds between various marginalized groups, and offering some preliminary tools for theorizing positionality, legibility, and identity beyond Eurocentric universalism and ethnic essentialism. While this practice is grounded less in theory than in the everyday experiences of the nominal second and third generation of migrants, who fall between the neat European division of insiders and foreigners, it is in line with queer of color critique's resurrection of queer as a term of materialist intersectional analysis, not merely synonymous with LGBTQI, but referencing processes of constructing normative and non-normative behaviors in populations, recognizing that the interaction of race, class, sexuality, and gender creates more complicated groupings and hierarchies between and within communities than simple dichotomies suggest, and working with rather than against the complex, at times contradictory connections and coalitions this system of heteronormativity produces. This opens the potential of refusing to obey the rules of speakability, expressing exactly the positionality deemed impossible in dominant discourses, namely that of Europeans of color. While multiculturalism constructs and fetishizes difference, women of color feminism and queer of color critique deconstruct neoliberal different but equal discourses that justify and maintain capitalist exploitation by not merely using but producing difference as a means to hide connections between, for example, the privatization of permanent war on the global south and the militarization of civil society in the West, resulting in the mass incarceration of people of color as normalized and profitable forms of population management. The queer of color authors Grace Hong and Roderick Ferguson write, I quote, "The mobilization of difference by women of color feminism and queer of color critique is intended not to erase the differentials of power, value, and social death within and among groups as in a multiculturalist model, but to highlight such differentials and to attempt to do the vexed work of forging a coalition politics through these differences. Queer of color critique allows to highlight the differentials of power produced by a European discourse of belonging that posits racialized others as the group whose exclusion is necessary for the survival of the larger Western project of inclusive humanism, but that also produces and maintains hierarchies among those excluded. And I want to suggest European queer of color activism as a means of both acknowledging the specifics of anti-Blackness and of allowing for a less limited understanding of Blackness, and for people of color coalitions beyond the US model. I believe there's potential in exploring the European constellation because of the different structural position of Blackness there between slavery, colonialism, and migration. I think it's also important to acknowledge that the very term people of color is under much criticism recently, in particular from the group of scholars calling themselves Afro-pessimists, Frank Wilderson, Jared Sexton, Christina Sharp, who see the very notion of people of color primarily as a means to obfuscate anti-Black racism. Afro-pessimism in itself is a reaction to a critique of the focus, or in part a reaction to the critique on the focus on the US and the Middle Passage as constitutive of African diaspora identity, a critique from scholars such as Paul Gilroy, Michelle Wright, or Ronaldo Walcott. Rather than identifying white supremacy as the main structural principle of global domination, for Afro-pessimists, anti-Blackness is central, which obviously shifts the position of non-Black people of color. People of color as a political construct came out of a global anti-colonial movement that emphasized colonialism rather than slavery as a connecting factor, and saw Africa as the center of current and future Black liberation. This moment is definitely gone. Africa is not representing any future, including for Afro-pessimists. Within Afro-diasporic discourse, it is largely relegated to the static embodiment of a lost past. This is problematic not only by centering of the United States and the marginalization of Africa, which fits all too well into existing patterns, it also minimizes the role of colonization in producing anti-Blackness and resistance to it. But Frank Wilderson calls Blackness a structural position, which of course is true as much for Europe as for any other place, a position that is not exactly the same everywhere. Chattel slavery, native dispossession, and genocide were foundational to the United States, but it does not mean that other forms of racism do not exist there, which is very obvious right now with extreme Islamophobia and the criminalization of the undocumented. In addition, in the US context, Blackness is something that immigrant groups of color have to distance themselves from to enter the American mainstream. In fact, one might argue that the very existence of the African American community as a native underclass allows and continues to allow this assimilative upward mobility towards whiteness for immigrants of color. In Europe, on the other hand, immigration often is coded Black. And it is the racialization of religion and colonialism that shaped the continental identity. The two strains of European racism combine in the treatment of the Muslim minority, which faces significantly different conditions in Europe than it does in the US, in part due to its different economic position due to labor and post-colonial migration. The largest part of the racialized poor in West Europe are Muslim, many of them of African descent, and our understanding of Blackness is further complicated in Eastern Europe, where Roma, who are persecuted across the continent, are racialized as Black, not as of African descent, but as Black nonetheless, with related stereotypes. An additional complication is that a significant number of Europeans of African descent are North African, not all of whom are Black, but some are. In Europe, as well as in North America, narratives around racism and Islamophobia separate neatly between Black and Muslim populations, Muslims and Africans, North and Sub-Saharan Africans. The separation is artificial in both contexts, but especially in Europe. a large number of black Europeans are Muslim, and a large number of Muslims are of African descent. They are the targets of intersecting forms of racism. And an intersectional analysis is necessary not only to address these intersecting racisms, but also to understand how anti-black racism among non-black Muslims and Islamophobia among non-Muslim black populations maintains this system of oppression. In short, black or African is not a term filled with absolute and essential meaning, but the result of a complicated and continuous process of often asymmetrical interactions and negotiations. While a generalized definition of black is both methodologically justified and politically necessary, diaspora discourse to a certain extent produces its own subject. The non-normative elements of the black European experience, rather than justifying their marginalization, could be used to complicate and challenge existing binaries and blind spots, and to decenter the US diaspora experience exactly through applying its theorizations to the European context. North Africa, direct neighbor to both Asia and Europe, and one of the centers of the Muslim world, could be an ideal space to explore these complications, potentially offering some answers to questions around the African diaspora and Islam, or on how racial discourses are transported between the West and the East. But North Africa has largely been excluded from African diaspora studies based on a consensus that follows a framework established by Hegel's division of Africa into three distinct parts, of which the North is supposedly the European one. The model of sub-Saharan Africa is the real black Africa, and the resulting whitening of the North worked to a large extent for an Africana studies focused on the Americas, but is nothing more than a working model, not a reflection of realities. And what it has to do is to leave out certain things. Earlier the question came up, or it was referenced that many African American authors who went to Europe throughout the 27th century acknowledged that there's a kind of very much in-your-face racism, but not a lethal threat. That's of course not true. In 1961, when many of those African Americans were in Europe, at least 200, maybe up to 400 North Africans were murdered in Paris on a single day, within a few hours, by the French police. So that happened in broad daylight. Being African in Europe at that point was not only, meant not only that you were living under a lethal threat, it literally meant that hundreds of people were killed and then completely forgotten, completely erased from history. The regional, religious, continental, and racial identifications of Africans affect internal as well as external group relations in ways that cannot be approached with a methodology based on the American situation alone, obviously. Thus, the ways in which Africanness and blackness interact need to be re-examined based on translocal dynamics rather than on preconceived universalist notions. A look at the African diaspora in Europe can be a step in that direction. Its positionality is shaped by the European link between racialization and migration, with its roots in colonialism as much as it is by the larger Black Atlantic constellation produced by racial slavery and the Enlightenment placing of blacks as anti-human. Continental European developments have been largely absent from theoretical debates within African diaspora studies, primarily due to the continent's supposedly secondary role in the central theme of the diaspora, the transatlantic slave trade. The focus on the latter necessarily defines diasporic populations who have entered the West through different trajectories, such as colonialism, as less representative of the Black Atlantic experience, even though that, of course, tends to downplay the connection between the slave trade and colonialism. A shift to a transnational diasporic perspective, inclusive of marginalized perspectives such as that of Black European or Afro-Latinx populations, requires that the specific cultural, historical, and political conditions that produce the dominant notions of the Black subject within Africana studies are examined and challenged if necessary. So to come back to my initial argument around the potential of queer people of color activism in Europe, the invisibility, if not impossibility, of Black European communities, their lack of spatial and temporal anchoring in national or diasporic formations, facilitated a questioning of heteronormative linear narratives of Black identity. The in-betweenness of Black Europeans created another queer dislocation and simultaneously a space within which to locate resistance. Even though I just have a few boring slides, this turns out to be a very interactive presentation. The queer diasporic positionality encompasses populations that do not necessarily share a common origin, however imaginary it might be, but a contemporary condition. Within this broadened understanding of diaspora, the concept is transformed from a term of temporal and spatial displacement focused on the past towards one of permanent productive dislocation directed at the future. To quote Gayatri Gopinath's path-breaking work on the Indian diaspora, suturing queer to diaspora recuperates those desires, practices, and subjectivities that are rendered impossible and unimaginable within conventional diasporic and nationalist imaginaries. A consideration of queerness, in other words, becomes a way to challenge nationalist ideologies by restoring the impure, inauthentic, non-reproductive potential of the notion of diaspora. And it is no coincidence that queer racialized Europeans, perfectly representing the subaltern of contemporary European discourses around race, religion, gender, sexuality, and migration, are at the center of this potential. Lesbians and trans people of color in particular do not only deal with structural racism, sexism, queer and transphobia in society in general, but simultaneously with these issues within activist communities. They don't ever have the luxury to take it for granted that their voices will be heard and their interests included. The solidarity that they are asked to provide to feminist, queer, Black, Muslim communities is often not granted to them in return because they remain deviant even in these communities. Nonetheless, lesbians and trans people of color remain key to anti-racist, feminist, and queer movements, often doing the least valued work while being faced with constant ignorance and aggression. At the same time, they also formed their own spaces of resistance, from the German Black women's collective ADEFRA, which for 30 years has been doing queer and feminist organizing within and beyond the Black German community, or the Dutch Black lesbian group Sister Outsider, the first of its kind in the Netherlands, founded in the mid-80s in response to the work of Black feminists like Audre Lorde, and active simultaneously in feminist, queer, and anti-racist movements to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, initiated by queer Black women. What these groups have in common is an approach that is attentive to the intersectional lives of people of color. As Audre Lorde put it, there's no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. Accordingly, they rejected the call to separate struggles around race, class, gender, and sexuality, a strategy often leading to the demand to ignore some issues until others, supposedly more important ones, are solved. They also reject calls to take sides, claims of "you are either with us or against us," loyalty demands directed at those considered politically suspect from all privileged perspectives, especially if they challenge the dominant progressive consensus. While this constellation plays out differently in different contexts, a systemic marginalization of those who face multiple oppressions is a characteristic of progressive politics across Europe and beyond. This radical intersectional activism receives little recognition, and if so, often hostile in forms of claims of reverse racism, of betraying the movement, and so on. These are the people the white socialist authors of the Call for Papers I cited earlier see as dividing the left, but similar conflicts exist in other movements. Queer people of color appears defiant in racist discourse, sexist discourse, revolutionary nationalist discourse, but also in feminist, liberal, LGBT discourse, and often get erased in claims that they are not yet ready to speak, while these same organizations that speak for them appropriate and depoliticize models of resistance originating in this radical activism. All this leads to the realization that we must start our political work from the recognition that multiple systems of oppressions are in operation not side by side, but intersecting and depending on each other. Therefore, it is impossible to dismantle capitalism without dismantling racism, which cannot be dismantled without dismantling sexism, and so on. This does not mean that particular struggles cannot be prioritized, but it means that inclusion in the existing system is not enough. The system itself needs to be changed. To quote Black lesbian feminist Kathy Cohen with regard to same-sex marriage rights, civil rights do not change the social order in dramatic ways. They change only the privileges of the group asserting those rights. Homophobia does not originate in our lack of full civil equality. Rather, homophobia arises from the nature and construction of the political, legal, economic, sexual, racial, and family systems within which we live, end quote. Therefore, all of these intersecting systems need to be changed before liberation can be achieved. If we understand liberation as the absence of a system of scarcity in which the withholding of basic human rights is not an exception, but the very logic around which the system is built. This also means that in order to form successful coalitions, we need to be honest about the ways in which these intersecting power structures affect us differently and create relative privilege for some of us because of our gender, race, religion, nationality, social class, and so on, privileges for which we have to take responsibility if we want to create lasting coalitions. This is a daunting task. The realization that all oppression is connected can be threatening. Questioning the dominant narrative does not only change our image of the other, but also the image of ourselves. It reminds us that being part of the same community, sharing the same identity, does not automatically mean we fight the same fight. But it also shows that common interest exists across national, religious, gender, ethnic lines. All oppression is connected, but so is resistance across the globe, and new kinds of coalitions, connections, and unity can emerge at any point, and they do. Even if these coalitions, for example, between socialist, feminist, queer, revolutionary Muslim activists in the squares of Cairo and Istanbul, between Black, German, and Namibian anti-colonial activists around the issue of reparations and repatriation, or between West African and West Asian refugees in Germany, are ephemeral and often end up seemingly domesticated into traditional single-issue formations. They show constellations emerging that are often deemed impossible. It is this politics of possibility, however momentary, that makes intersectional coalitions so powerful. But in order to build them, we have to be attentive both to histories of struggles and to current constellations. This means that we cannot follow a path that others have created, even if it worked for them. If we want to create truly transformative change, we cannot look for leaders. Instead, we have to learn to trust ourselves. As poet, activist, and academic June Jordan observed almost 4 decades ago, I quote, "We are not powerless. We are indispensable despite all atrocities of the state and corporate policy to the contrary. At the very least, if we cannot control things, we certainly can mess them up," end quote. Thank you.
one back there.
Hi. Oh, should I just go?
Oh, I'll get him after. I'll get him.
Okay. So, thank you so much for your talk. A lot of really insightful comments about the current situation in Europe and a lot of references that I need to look up. I wanted to ask you a question about your thoughts on Afro-pessimism. I found that really interesting. It's text that I've been dealing a lot with in my work. So I thought your critique was very spot on about whether or not Afro-pessimism centers the Black American experience too much and to what extent it could hinder coalition building. And I wanted to say that, so personally, one of the things that I found really useful about Afro-pessimism in the focus of anti-Blackness was this notion that anti-Blackness exists all over the world. And it made me think of this experience I had once in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, where one of the times I got called the N-word in Berlin was in Kreuzberg, by a Turkish German. And so this notion that in all communities, even communities that might think of themselves as people of color, there can be anti-Blackness. And so I was wondering, so there's been interesting work done on the problem of anti-Blackness in Muslim communities, maybe more so by American scholars. So I was wondering, in your work with Black Muslims in Europe, has that ever been an issue that people have raised? Like, have they expressed dealing with anti-Blackness in Muslim communities in Europe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people have expressed it, but it is a very touchy issue. During the earlier presentation about current activism in Germany, I was reminded of what I think was one of my formative experiences, which was a weekend meeting, I think in the early 90s, somewhere in northern Germany in the countryside. And it was West African, it was a feminist meeting, West African women, Black German women, Turkish German women, mostly Kurdish women. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was a huge fight. Everything exploded. Because, yeah, as I said, and as we all know, even if you want to be on the same side, we aren't necessarily, because there's lots of pressures on us to place ourselves in a particular existing hierarchy. And even if we question one element of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that we question the other or know how to do that. So I do think, because you said it's not really talked about right now, I wonder if it needs to be talked about in a way we talked about then, which was more like yelling at each other, because there was so much going on many levels. There was the question of something that activists are used to talk about much more now, unacknowledged privileges. So African migrant women wanted us as Black Germans to think about what it means to have a German passport. And then what a strong impulse was not to necessarily think about that, but instead to turn to the Turkish women and ask them to think about white skin privilege. So considering the fact that, at least I believe, we live in a global system of racial capitalism, it is impossible, I think, to create a safe space in which we just talk about that, because the conditions are so difficult that this is a conversation that can be constructive in the long run, but I don't think at the moment when it happens. And structurally, there's a huge difference between a German Muslim of Turkish descent, for example, and a Syrian Muslim from Syria who's been in Germany for 4 weeks. So what you have is people using intersections and connections to try to start conversations. but I don't know if you ask, is there an acknowledgement of anti-black racism, or also on the other end on Islamophobia among especially Christian black people. I know that is an issue that is more present, but also very touchy in France. And it's often tabled along the lines of, if you want to have a collision about police violence right now, let's not talk about that. So yeah, but I think that's just a part of coalitional politics. And I do think that Afro-pessimism opens up certain topics and then immediately closes them again in a frustrating way. But of course, I think Afro-pessimists ask a lot of important questions. And I do think the notion of people of color is one that needs to be interrogated and not taken for granted.
Thank you for being present. I know that we live in a global milieu that is dominated by the European, I would say the European perspective of how things operate, or I should say European system, that is predominantly says that we have a structure that we know best. We know how things work. You need to follow us because we have all the answers, so to speak. My question is that we have a global fruit basket of wisdom from people not only from the European North, but also from the Asian East and the African South and the First Nations West. And so there's a basket of wisdom there that if we think that, or if we want to become or be healthy, optimally, we need to draw on these wisdom. And so what I'm trying to say is that how can we move forward? What is the plan to move forward to draw on all these different diverse wisdom to enable us to see folks and see the differences as something useful to be utilized collectively?
What is the plan, huh? Well, I think in some ways we all are being fairly resilient just because we're here and not lying in bed with a cover over our heads, which I think would be an almost healthy reaction to what's going on right now. But I do think that what is part of this European model that claims to know everything is also this idea of very linear time and linear movements and linear notions of cause and effect. I think that while things might look very bad right now, other models are already in motion. We might not see exactly where they will be going, and that requires a certain faith that sometimes it's hard to keep, but I think in the end it's the more optimistic position, because if we use this traditional model that is also very often characteristic of the left, we can only lose, but we lose because the powers that are against us are so overwhelming. So that we get up and fight again is in some ways a victory, and it's more materially a victory because fights, it's also how we tell stories, right? Because in some ways, the whole Occupy Wall Street movement was not necessarily my thing, but it wouldn't be wouldn't have been possible without the so-called Arab Spring, which also took place in West Africa. But coming back to this recurring thing of the domination of U.S. models or U.S. discourses or U.S. culture, once it lands in the U.S., it becomes legible across the world, so that when something similar happens in Istanbul, which is much closer connected to the indignados in Spain, or the people in Cairo or Tunisia, they instead call themselves Occupy, because this is a kind of language that indicates a connection. So part of the problem, I think, is that we don't have a language that easily describes other connections. For example, South-South connections, but also others. But those connections are there. And I do think this basket of wisdom that you refer to is drawn upon in ways that I think don't produce a master plan. I think the master plan is also one of those models that we have to get rid of. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's something I think a lot about, where I see things happening that I know are made possible because of other things that have happened, but very often there's no knowledge, which disempowers us, right? Because we do something and we think it's the first time, which makes it much harder. People have done it before, but that knowledge has been repressed, so we have to find ways to collect that knowledge. I think that's one thing, to make it accessible. And then we have to use it. And I do think it happens all the time, locally, translocally. So I can't really tell you what the plan is, but I do think that that resistance is happening. Okay, I'm glad.
Test. Now is it on? Yeah. I appreciated your talk. Thank you very, very much. One thing that African American educators talk about is the need to, when you're trying to bring about change, to address the structural, but also the individual, and things like implicit bias. And I'm wondering if that's kind of a prerequisite for queerness, is to sort of look inward also and kind of look at biases. And I'm wondering if in the activist work that you do, if that's part of the process, is kind of not just addressing the structural, but these sort of biases that everybody has towards other groups, even when you're working within a group.
I think it's a necessity if you speak from a subject position that is not the dominant one in a particular context, because you are forced to explain yourself, and you're forced to explain yourself in a way that is relatable. And in terms of activism, I think you have to make choices. I feel connected to various communities because of my own positionality, I would say, not necessarily identity. I do think that structural is central, but the structural, of course, is played out in individual interactions as well. That's why that's part of the reason I talked about this endless, where are you from? Because it's very often seen as an individual thing, right? It's not, it's structural. It's individuals playing out of structures, whether they know it or not. So yeah, I do think it's probably, or maybe being Black, queer, culturally Muslim, I was forced to think more about my positionality maybe than others. Maybe not. But I'm not sure I get what your question is, but the structure and the individual always interact. But certainly, this is also a frustration very often with white people, right, who want the separation, who, want to be recognized as good people because they recognize the structure, which is a pretty tiresome process. But Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's connected. I don't know if that's what you asked.
Yes, I appreciated your talk very much. I just wanted to ask you a question about being lost in translation. You had this argument that basically it's a question about how negotiate the global when there's a question whether there is such a thing. And I would like to put it that way. So, which I know is for Afro-German communities an issue, but it is also an issue for other communities. This question is that when the discourse migrates to the States and then comes back, let's say to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, wherever, your argument was that it becomes sort of a more universal discourse or lingua. But I wanted to ask you also how do you negotiate what is actually precisely lost in that translation when it comes back? Because I think that's where actually one of the frontiers is to actually negotiate the more insidious repressive moments of globalization, which is where capitalism may actually be just even like a lesser issue, but there's like a more repressive issue of like how this it's not a linguistic issue, but it's one of like how this translation works. So that would be my question: how you would negotiate that, let's say, between the German situation and maybe also the American situation, because you're operating in both discourses, and so I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Maybe you should read my thoughts on that, because that's a huge topic that I've worked on a lot, and I don't think I can summarize in 2 minutes or so. I do agree with you that translation is a huge issue, and that there's a tension between the need to find a common language and the inability to really translate all specifics. At the same time, of course, we have to acknowledge that a lot of stuff gets translated anyway. One thing that I find striking about Germany is that you have so much talk about political correctness and identity politics, and how there's an attack on white males, blah, blah, blah. So very much the discourse that you have in the US, but in the US, you can at least read it as a reaction to pressure being put at this complete discursive dominance that white males had at a certain point. In Germany, this dominance still exists, so why do these people feel that the US discourse can be translated? Why do white journalists in liberal newspapers write about this again and again? Because it speaks to something that they find translatable. So what I'm trying to say is that while we have to be very critical and conscious of the process of translation and can't just assume that we speak the same language, we also have to think about when translation becomes an issue and when it is just accepted as part of a transnational discourse. And I do think the fact that a very common European reaction to raising the issue of race is to say, well, this is an Americanization of European culture, is something that should give us pause. Because it is a way to end certain discussions when they come from a subject position that is not the dominant one, the white one. So yeah, as I said, translation and what gets lost in translation is an endless topic, a very important topic. Yeah, I also think that one thing that we can do, rather than just throw up our hands and say, yes, everything, something gets lost in translation all the time, which is true, is to try to be very careful in tracing the process and to acknowledge a certain genealogy and where terms come from. one thing that I find a little frustrating in the European discussion among queer people of color, sometimes, to come back to the notion of queerness, is that especially in France, people are like, leave me alone with queer. That's a totally white term. But of course, the reason for that, and it's true because it has been appropriated by a very white movement in France, but what this white movement also did, and what many of the white American authors that those white French people translated did, was to ignore the fact that queer authors of color, like Audre Lorde, like Gloria Anzaldúa, were at the beginning of this process. So in some ways, if you reject a particular term without knowing its full history, you might also cut yourself off from a counter narrative. So yeah, it's complicated, I guess. It's what I can say in short.
Hi, thank you, Fatima. I'm going to stick with this question of process. Holding this position of respecting intersectionality, realizing they all have to go on at the same time, that not choosing sides, of not going just full on one issue and saying this is the issue. How does one hold that position when everyone, including those going after the other issues, even in solidarity, are pushing you in a different direction? I guess how do you stay in that, I don't know whether you want to call it a queer space that says, no, I'm not going to disrespect these other positions. I'm going to actually hold this one. I agree completely. We can't know the goal because the goal has to emerge from our human interaction. So I'm more concerned with the process and how one stays loyal to those things you were holding up. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't think I have an easy answer, but this is, I think, part of the potential of queer of color critique. And one of its foundational authors, Jose Munoz, for me in a very insightful way, talks about how queer of color critique cannot offer you a position. It doesn't give you rules, and if you apply them and if you act this particular way, then you will stay on course. What it requires is for you to constantly question your own position. And of course, that's exhausting, and sometimes you just don't want to do it, but you have to do it. And I do think queer people of color do it not because they're more advanced than other people, but for them it's more a question of survival, because if you ignore certain things, you ignore certain parts of yourself, and what that does, you feel immediately before other people might feel it. Yeah, I mean, generally it is, I think, being able to simultaneously have faith and accept a certain uncertainty as your permanent state. It is very challenging, but I also think that's the reason why situational coalitions are a good model, because at certain points it might be possible to work with others and achieve something, but then you have to break off the coalition. And then the usual model would be say, well, everything you did together is now discredited. But the challenge is to not do that, to just accept this is how far it goes, and we might intersect at some point, but at this point it doesn't work. Yeah, and it is, it's not something that is easy to sell because it's hard work and you don't gain something really tangible. But on the other hand, all these other seemingly much more simple methods obviously don't work. So.
Hello. Oh. This talk has been such a gift, Fatima. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a question about creolization, because I know that it's a concept that you work through in European others. And if you could talk a bit about what's productive and prohibitive with this concept and thinking about some of these same issues in terms of Black European and Black German studies, and especially what you were saying about the diversity within communities?
Well, I think in terms of creolization, people use the concept meaning different things, and I think it's kind of in line with what I just said about queer of color critique. It can be useful, but you can't just say I'm doing creolization and then you have the right take on things. What I found very useful, especially with Glissant's work, was this was a way to think about, in some ways, about a presence that is not grounded, or about the question of authenticity, right? Because this is something that comes up with Blackness, but also in other contexts, what is the authentic Black subject? And how can you let go of that without letting go of a common notion of Blackness? And to me, creolization was a model that could offer that, because it's, or at least in the way I understood it. Or another way of putting it was what Toni Morrison said about Black culture. One of the characteristics of Black culture being just to basically pick up what you find and do something with it. Which in some ways for me is creolization. It's not just to pick and choose, because you can. It's circumstances put you in a particular position, and these are the options you have. And what you do is not try to create, or at least in Glissant's sense, to try to create what he calls a sacred model. So out of these pieces that you find, you create a seamless whole. What you do instead is you use the pieces. Yeah, I think that's the best I can say right now, at least.
Thank you, Fatima. The last point that you made me go back to the gentleman here who talked about the different fruits of wisdom, and the idea that we often, we talk to students about going into communities or to doing internships or to do service learning, and the idea is not to go in thinking that you know all the answers and that the community has none and is just waiting for you to show up, as opposed to knowing that there are things going on and where you can fit in and take those pieces and do something with them. In your discussion about coalition buildings, one of the things that I think sometimes gets left or gets short shrift is the whole notion that before we get to the coalition, we have to have allies. And when you were talking about different groups coming together and how it deteriorated, I have a Southeastern Asian colleague and friend with whom in New Orleans next week, we're working with student leaders about excellence in writing and so forth, and we were talking about how to get to that point. What would we be doing? What kind of writing would we be asking them to produce toward the end of the workshop? And she does work with deliberative dialogue and the different approaches to how you actually do listen to others when they're presenting on particular issues. And so one of the things we talked about is how things can go south, as we say, because we lose the point of the dialogue and turn to debate. And then in debate, it's who's going to be heard the loudest, or whose pain is the most, and so forth. And the whole idea of moving forward seems to get lost. So I was wondering if you would possibly speak a little bit to the building toward the coalition that has been happening in the work that you do and what you see in terms of Afro-Germans and in Germany and so forth.
Well, I have to tell you, one of the, I don't miss many things about Germany, but I do miss some things. And one of the things I miss is how much Germans like to argue about everything. So to your point about debate, I don't know. I think sometimes things have to go south or break apart. I don't think it's, yeah, I don't know. I feel like that it's important to listen, it's important to keep coalitions, but very often it's also important to be honest about differences, and that is a process that's a lot more painful. And I don't think I'm not sure if our ambition should always be to deal with those differences in a constructive way, and if we don't know how to do it, just not to do it. Maybe it's okay to just yell at each other and to learn that that's not the end of the world. Because I don't know. If I think about activism and the people I would trust most, it's not the people I never fought with. So I think in some ways it's a cultural difference, because Germans like to argue, but that has obvious disadvantages. After I left Germany, I first moved to the Netherlands, and it was awesome because the Dutch people are so polite. They just don't tell you what they think, which is great because what they think is exactly what the Germans think, so you don't really need to hear it. But you know, you need a balance, and I feel like especially for people of color and especially in activism, so much is at stake. So the idea that you might have a fallout can be so threatening that it's you know, it's a sensible decision to just not go there. At the same time, sometimes we do have to go there, but it's, I mean, the system puts us in a position where we constantly have to make painful choices. So with coalitions and allies, yeah, I do. I mean, personally, I work on coalitions within communities of color because I feel that there's enough common ground that potentially these fallouts don't have to be the end. With white people, I mean, yeah. How do you do the whole listening thing? If you're historical, white people have to shut up for the next 500 years. They're not going to do that. So, so to be all fair, yeah, that would be great. But maybe you just can't be. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a right answer, but obviously that's something we all who are in activist communities think about a lot of times. But that's also what brings me back to women of color feminism, black feminism, the question of difference, right? And how difference can be powerful if we're not scared of it. But of course, we're taught constantly to be scared of difference. So we have to unlearn that. And part of it is definitely to listen, to learn to listen. But part of it is also to allow ourselves to say things that we have been trained not to say.
When one of the other or both in concert with each other do then reach a point where other people are listening. It's a communication issue, and it wasn't about either or. It's about knowing when which actually is being most effective, but certainly having them both in your toolkit to use when they're necessary. Thank you for your answer.
Performance. I walk on air, which will be, it's roughly 4 blocks south here on St. George, so you just continue on this street, just use that as a reference point regardless of where you're headed next for dinner. That's free admission, as you know, but please share the word anyway if you know of other friends that might be interested in coming. It's not too late to recruit them. And if you need any suggestions for places to eat, please don't hesitate to turn to Karina or myself or Jillian or Veronica. We've gotten to know a few faces today for suggestions specific to your interests. So I guess, guten Appetit, bon appetit. And the building is the Robert Gill Theater. However, that is not, it's good that you ask actually, it's not clearly labeled because it's a building that houses a number of different, well, has a number of different functions, but Jillian and Veronica will be in front just to sort of reassure you, yes, this really is the right place, so go by house number, and the entrance is an entrance, yes, but it doesn't look like a grand theatrical entrance, so be forewarned. It's in the same building as the bookstore, but you won't see the bookstore when you go to the theater. So when you go in the building, immediately there's a staircase, a grand staircase, and just follow it to the 3rd floor.